Welcome to the first presentation in the Vitis Gen 2 webinar series for 2020. Today's webinar is Some of the Economics of Grape Varietal Innovations. My name is Becky Weeps, and I am the Extension Support Specialist for the New York Statewide Viticulture Extension Program. I'm also part of the Extension and Outreach team for the Vitis Gen 2 project. A few technical notes before we start. If you move your mouse to the bottom of the screen, you will see a menu. Click on the chat to open the chat bar. Go ahead and introduce yourself, make comments, and to let me know if you can't hear anything or can't see what you're supposed to be seeing. Be sure to go into the drop-down menu and change it to send to all panelists and attendees so that the conversation can be kind of between everybody that's here. And then at the bottom, you'll also see that Q&A button. Use that to ask your questions. That way we can kind of keep track of all of them. And we'll stop for questions at the end of the presentation, but feel free to submit them whenever they come up throughout the presentation. Our panelists today are speaking to us from Davis, California. They're Julian Alston and Olena Sambucci. Julian is the team leader of the Trade Economics team for the Vitis Gen 2 project and is a distinguished professor at UC Davis. Olena is a postdoctoral scholar at UC Davis and has also been part of the Trade Economics team for Vitis Gen 2. So with that, I'll hand it over to Julian. And you can go ahead and share your screen now, Julian.
Okay, thanks, Becky. I'm sharing a pretty ugly screen right now.
That is okay.
There we go, and I'll just start this PowerPoint. There, are we good?
That looks great.
All right, thanks. The audio's good? Okay, so thanks very much, Becky, for hosting this and introducing us. I'm sitting here with Lena, and we titled this Some of the Economics of Grape Varietal Innovations because clearly it's a very big subject, and we can only touch on bits of it today, the bits we know something about and we've been working on. We've split this presentation into two parts. I'll go first and followed by Lena, and then we hope there'll be time left for some interaction. I'm going to introduce the general concepts and the way economists think about modeling varietal innovations in general, in grapes in particular, and how we measure the consequences of that. We've got some examples of work we've done over the past 10 years or so, looking at economics of Pierce's disease and resistant varieties to that, powdery mildew resistance. We can also think about measuring and valuing the benefits from quality traits, and with respect to these resistance technologies, we want to introduce resistance traits and at the same time not reduce or even improve quality traits. That's kind of question that comes up. And in some of these technologies, we're concerned about environmental externalities associated with things like pesticides, and one of the ways varietal technologies can generate benefits is by reducing the environmental burden of pesticides. So we'll touch on that. And then I'll hand over to Lena, and she'll talk about our current work in particular, where we're looking at varietal innovation in California table grapes, and she'll tell you all about what's going on there in terms of looking backwards at the varietal improvements that have been done already in California by the private sector and government, and also looking forward to do some consumer surveys and industry surveys to evaluate the traits that are being introduced. So the way economists think about things, well, a way is to think about variable profit per acre. So this is gross revenue price times yield is revenue per acre minus variable costs. And we can say, how does that change after we adopt a new variety or any other innovation? And so we've got price, the new price is the old price times 1 plus a proportional price premium. And then you've got the new yield is 1 plus a proportional yield gain times the old yield. And then the variable cost is 1 minus a proportional cost saving times the old variable cost. So that's the way the new profit is defined. And so we can think about the change in profit as being equal to the difference between those two. And that comes out quite neatly as a proportional gain times gross revenue per acre. So the proportional gain is the proportional price premium plus the proportional yield gain plus the proportional saving in variable costs weighted by variable costs as a share of total costs. So this is a way of thinking about the gain. It's a reduction in variable costs if we're holding everything else constant on the acre and just changing the variety, and it has these consequences for price, if there's a quality advantage, for yield, and for variable costs. And it could make costs go up, and in which case that would be a negative gain, if you like. So there's the way we think about it is the proportional, the change in profit is equal to the proportional benefit, K, times gross revenue per acre, and that K term captures all of these elements of the benefits in terms of quality premium, yield gain, cost savings. So how do we measure these things? And we've got various ways we try to measure the elements of benefits, whether they're perceived by consumers or by producers. Sometimes we can observe the price premium in the market. If we're looking at things that already exist, we can see them. Sometimes we have to elicit values from consumers or producers if they're not visible in market transactions. Sometimes we can observe the yield gains in the field. Sometimes we have to rely on experimental evidence, and sometimes we have to ask experts. And then cost savings. These and costs could go up or down and still be a profitable technology if the revenue gain is sufficient to compensate. These can be pecuniary changes in the sense that we're talking about out-of-pocket expenses, or they can be non-pecuniary, and there we're thinking about environmental factors like concern for wildlife or water quality or farm worker safety and so on. And so if we can measure these things at the level of the individual acre, then we want to scale them up to represent the total gains to the industry or society as a whole, and we use market models to do that. We often talk about this gross annual research benefits, and I've got it written there with the subscript T plus N. So if we're in year T, we're thinking about benefits in future periods, not just in the current period, some perhaps 10, 20, 50 years in the future. And so the benefit in any particular year, gross annual research benefits, is equal to K, that proportional gain, times the value of production. And so this is looking forward, we're thinking about the expectations in some future year of benefits per acre. And this is equal to the expectation, that's what the E with the subscript T stands for, times the probability of research. This is very intuitive, I hope, but this is what are the odds of successful research? If we have a successful research project and it develops a useful new technology, what fraction of the industry adopts the results? And then for the adopters, what's the proportion of productivity gain? We multiply all those things together and scale that by the value of production. And that's our measure of gross annual research benefits. So we have to do this kind of analysis over time, looking, so we incur costs over many years in the process of developing these new technologies. In the case of an agronomic crop like wheat, these processes are quite long. For perennial crops like grapes, they're even longer. The biology is sufficiently different that the research is more expensive and takes longer, and then the process of adoption takes longer because grapevines last 25 or more years. So we're doing a benefit cost analysis where we're comparing a stream of costs over some number of years against a stream of benefits. And we can see on the green part, the positive side, we're starting to get benefits as more and more acres are adopting this technology, and that K shift is applying to a larger and larger share of the total area produced. Eventually, we have a decline in these annual benefits because either the technology is becoming less effective because pests and diseases co-evolve and develop resistance to the technology, or because the technology becomes obsolete, it's replaced with some other technology. So we've got this issue in doing the benefit cost analysis where we've got to look at benefits and costs over time, and tricky parts of the analysis are getting an understanding of the lags in the R&D process, how many years that takes, maybe 5, 10, 20 years in many cases. Then the adoption process itself takes many years, maybe 10, 20 years. And then eventually there's a disadoption process. And these all depend on what else is going on in terms of the durability of the technology and what's going on in the market and so forth as preferences shift among different kinds of grape products, for example. So example number one, and I have two, is Pierce's disease. It's a serious disease of grapevines in the world. It's been the subject of research in our department for a good 10 or 20 years, starting with some work with Kate Fuller and Kabir Tumba, which was published in 2014. So we've modelled and measured the cost of this disease, the consequences of the policy that manages the spread of the pest and the disease, and the benefits from R&D to address that. So those are these three papers I've mentioned here. This is a disease that's endemic in California, and it's different in different parts of California between the northern California, where there's not much production, Napa Sonoma, which is lower yielding, but that reflects also very higher value per tonne of grapes. And then we go all the way down to the southern San Joaquin Valley, where we've got much higher yields, but also much lower prices. So we've got a very diverse industry with different wine production systems, and we have this pest. The blue-green sharpshooters are native to California, and it spreads the disease in the riparian corridor in the Napa Valley, and it does some damage, but it's not devastating. It's just a chronic problem. We had an invasive sharpshooter. The glassy-wing sharpshooter came into California in the late 90s, and it devastated the industry in Temecula. So this became of great concern to the industry in Northern California, and we started looking into barriers to movement of the pest, ways to reduce the prevalence of the pest that spreads the disease, and new technologies to manage the pests, including biological control and chemical pesticides, as well as genetics, which we think is the best possibility for addressing this issue. And then a program began in 2000 to prevent the movement of the sharpshooter from Southern California to the north. And so our economic analysis was looking at the damage done by the pest and the disease, both the damage done by the disease in the presence of the native sharpshooters and with potentially the spread of the invasive sharpshooter, the benefits from the Pierce's disease control program in restricting that damage, and then the potential benefits from the development and adoption of resistant varieties. And so we've got a lot of measurement challenges. There's a lot to know about the cost of the disease and how the pest grows and spreads, and how the disease is spread and so forth. And we spent a lot of time eliciting information from experts and so forth. And I can only be very brief about this. We've published the papers that document in detail, but we estimated that since 2000, and this was up until 2011, that we were spending approximately 50 million per year in keeping the sharpshooter, the glassy-wing sharpshooter in Southern California. We estimated that was generating benefits on the order of 93 million per year, given that we had the Pierce's disease control program in place at the time. so that was paying for itself. And then we compared that. We looked at the expenditure on research, and the total expenditure was around 51 million over the first 12 years of that program. A lot of that money was being spent on resistant varieties, and particularly the development of transgenic rootstocks. But significant money was going into conventional breeding done by Andy Walker at Davis. And we analysed the benefits from the adoption of resistant varieties, whether they were transgenic or conventional varieties, looking 50 years ahead. And under various plausible assumptions, we estimated a range of benefits from 150 to 425 million. That's the total benefits in present value terms, given that we have the Pierce's disease control program in place restricting the sharpshooter's movement. If that program were to end, then the damage from the disease would be much greater, and the benefits from resistant varieties would be much greater too. So in the outbreak scenario, we analysed what would happen if we had the glassy wing sharpshooter all through California doing much more damage, and then the benefits from resistant varieties would be on the order of twice as much, so 295 million to 925 million. And these ranges are driven by two main parameters. The one is, how long does it take to get the technology developed and available and adopted? And then what percentage of the affected areas adopt the technology? And so the wide range is because we're not really confident about those aspects. So since then, we've had some success. So Andy Walker has released now with colleagues 5 new varieties of hybrids. They're vinifera varieties crossed with American varieties, and then cross back and back crossed until they've got a very high percentage of vinifera genetics, but they're also highly resistant to Pierce's disease. And these varieties are now available and starting to be adopted. And as Andy Walker says, the wine made from these varieties is very good, and the resistance is very good. So now we can potentially go backwards and check and see how well we did at predicting the payoffs of this research 10 years later. The second example is powdery mildew. This is a different kind of disease. Pierce's disease has a serious problem because it actually destroys capital. It kills vines, whereas powdery mildew is a different kind of problem. It damages the fruit. It doesn't particularly damage the vine. It's quite controllable with the use of mildewcides. It's expensive though. So on average across California, about 5% of industry gross revenue is spent on controlling powdery mildew. It's a very big share of the total use of pesticides in California, and it's the predominant use of pesticides in the grape industry. We've written this story up in several publications, including studies on the cost of the disease and the benefits from resistance and so on. So it's expensive and hard to measure the cost of powdery mildew management, but in California we have very detailed records on pesticide usage, and using those records and what the pesticides were used for and when, and we can infer from that information the total volume of different kinds of pesticides applied to control powdery mildew, and we can estimate from University of California cost and return studies what the application costs and so forth were, and we can also take a shot at looking at the non-pecuniary costs borne by farm workers, the environment, and so on. And so our estimates are that back in 2011, producers were spending 71 million on materials, and a further 118 million on cost of applying those materials to control powdery mildew, and that's where we get our approximately 5% of total industry revenue. But in some parts of California, it's more like 20% of revenue where the grapes are particularly susceptible. So we did our study looking at some examples here. Central Coast Chardonnay, we chose that because white grapes are particularly susceptible to damage by powdery mildew, and in cooler areas like the Central Coast, they're particularly susceptible. So this is the area where we think the damage is most important to growers, and this is where we're told it may be as much as 20% of gross revenue spent on controlling powdery mildew. We looked at raisin and table grapes, and they're in the San Joaquin Valley, and they're different in a few ways. In the case of wine grapes, the vinifera varietal names are very important in the market, and so if we replace conventional varieties with conventionally bred non-vinifera varieties, we forego that market advantage. If we can use genetic engineering to create resistant varieties, we may be able to retain the advantage of the vinifera varietal name as well, although depending on market attitudes to the use of genetic engineering, that may be an issue. And looking forward, we're thinking about gene editing technologies and so forth, which may be more acceptable, we hope. In the case of raisin and table grapes, they're not usually sold with as much emphasis on varietal names. At least there's different regard for the traditional varieties. There's much more innovation in varieties in table grapes, as Olena will explain. And so we suspect there'll be less market resistance, at least to the hybrids. So we've used the University of California cost and return studies as a basis, and then we've improved and extended them, brought them up to date to calculate the cost for several production systems of powdery mildew management and the benefits correspondingly that would be achieved if those resistant varieties could be used to replace the conventional ones. And we did this for three cases. One is a particular variety of table grapes, Crimson Seedless, which was an important variety at the time when we did this work, a bit less so now. Thompson Seedless and Fiesta and so forth for raisins, and Chardonnay on the Central Coast for wine. So we augmented the cost and return studies details with other information from discussion with farm advisors and so on. We came up with these estimates of the annual benefits per acre for the different production systems. This is all of raisin grapes. It was $186 per acre per year, applied to a total area of 195.9 thousand acres, gives a benefit of 36.4 million a year for raisin grapes. For Central Chardonnay Coast, Central Coast Chardonnay, it was 7.5 million. That's just for one variety in one region. And for Crimson Seedless table grapes, it's 3.7 million per year. And again, that's just for one variety. So it's only a part of the industry, whereas for raisins, it's the entire industry. We had to make assumptions about how quickly things would happen. These are our best guesses on these things. And then we project forward and calculate the present value today under different assumptions about adoption rates and lags. So this table shows for raisins, we've got different rows for adoption rates for 20, 60 or 100% adoption. And then we've got how long do we have to wait before the varieties become available, 10, 20 or 30 years, and that completes this table. And the numbers range from as low as $20.9 million. That's the total present value, $20.9 million today after waiting 30 years, if only 20% of the industry adopts. That number's almost twice as big if we only have to wait 10 years. And then it's 10 times as big if we have 100% adoption. So that's the reason we have this big range, is because of uncertainty about how quickly the technology can be developed and how widely it will be adopted once it has been developed. So for Central Coast Chardonnay, the numbers range from 4.3 to almost 40 million, and that's for the same kinds of reasons. And for crimson seedless table grapes, it ranges from 2.1 million to 19.3 million. So these are examples of the kinds of things we can estimate for this kind of problem. The implication of this analysis is that the private payoff depends a lot on how widely these varieties will be adopted when they become available, and that's where we run into these questions about market resistance related to the vinifera varietal name or transgenic technologies. But also another offsetting that is how effective will the current pesticides continue to be, and will they be allowed to continue to use them, because we have increasing government decisions to disallow the use of technologies that have been used to date because of concerns about environmental and other damages. The social payoff includes benefits from the reduced pesticide load on the environment that we have not measured here. We can't put a money measure on that. We've looked at some indexes of environmental burden associated with different production systems. We've got two indexes that provide different messages about these things. We do know that there's relatively low rates of illnesses of farm workers associated with management of pests in grapes. A large share of the pesticide that is used is sulfur that's comparatively benign. Okay, so the bottom line, we're dealing here with long-lasting, valuable biological capital in the form of grapevines, and the genetics is embodied in those vines, and so that changes things for this kind of question compared with, say, new wheat varieties. And pests and diseases can destroy that capital, and if they do that, it takes years to, and sometimes it's impossible to replace that capital. I visited a vineyard in South Australia where they have some bushvine Grenache that are 170 years old. You cannot replace that legacy. And so these are different kinds of issues. The payoffs depend on the lags and the adoption rates, as I've been describing, and we're uncertain about those, and they depend on some things that we're working on in terms of understanding market resistance. In many cases, genetic solutions offer the greatest potential to address these kinds of concerns. One thing that's different about grapes and wine compared with, say, cereals is that we've got highly differentiated products using different genetics and different production systems, and they're reproduced vegetatively. So there's a bigger process of introducing new genes in this kind of industry than in a cereal crop. And we have these particular issues of market resistance that are different. They're widespread throughout the economy, but they're different for consumer products, and they're different for wine grapes in particular. With that, I'll hand over to Lena.
Hey, Julian, can I ask you a question or two? This is
Sure,
Tim Martinson.
Tim, if you will. Yep.
Yeah. Just a question on the powdery mildew. When you were looking at the benefits of the powdery mildew resistant, were you making any assumption that they would have to, instead of spraying 10 times, maybe spray once or twice? Or was that just totally without other means of control?
It's a little bit complicated, and we probably haven't got time to go deeply into it, but there are some sprays that are used to control both powdery mildew and other problems, and so you won't save all the sprays that might have been helping to control powdery mildew, and you'll have to keep using some sprays that for other diseases that also happen to help with powdery mildew. So what we did was try to deduce the things that you could stop doing if you had a wholly resistant variety that needed the specific treatment for powdery mildew.
Yeah. And the other thing that comes to mind is that if you have a resistant variety, it imposes sort of constant selection pressure on the population. So so the thought being that for resistance management, you're not going to have a no spray vineyard. You're going to have a much reduced spray vineyard.
I'm the wrong person to ask about this, Tim.
Yeah.
We have talked with Lance Cadle Davidson and other colleagues in the VitasGen project, and they've told us we shouldn't worry too much about resistance development, even though we know powdery mildew develops resistance very quickly to chemical pesticides within a season. But we've told that the idea is we're talking about a variety that has very durable resistance here.
Yeah.
And that can be achieved by, I understand, by employing multiple resistance genes stacked. But we're above my pay grade now in this context.
Yeah. I think that's a hypothesis that they have, that they're hoping that by stacking different modes of action together, then that will provide more durable resistance. But I still come back to the idea that, well, if you spray a fungicide on, it goes away after a while. But if you have a resistant vine out there, it's sort of on all the time. So that some of the thoughts here are that you're still going to have to spray something with, say, a different mode of action to eliminate those rare resistant individuals. Okay, thanks. This is very complicated stuff to do, Julian, and I applaud you guys for all the things you have to do to estimate value.
All right, this is Olena now, and I just want to add super quickly to what you were just asking, Julian. Our estimates definitely were on the conservative side. We did allow, so we only looked at powdery mildew sprays in the critical control season for powdery mildew when we looked at pesticide application data. So we think included only about 85% of the sprays. So we did allow for some sprays in that other season that were applied for other things. And also when we did the analysis with the budgets, we did include, I think, 1 or 2 sprays to control mites, which use the same fungicide product. So we did not completely eliminate the powdery mildew treatment program, just precisely for the reasons you just described.
Okay, thanks, Elena.
Yeah, sure. I'm going to talk a little bit about the work we're doing on VitasGen 2. So this is the trade economics team. So Julian and I, and then we also have Bradley and Nicole at Cornell and Karina and Washington State University. So we're all working on VitasGen on various aspects, which I will talk about next. So 2 socioeconomic objectives that we've been looking at over the last year are to estimate the value of specific traits. So new varieties, as Julian just kind of described the methods that we're using, they can have agronomic traits and quality traits. And so they have a value to consumers and producers, or both. And difference either in price they're getting or cost reduction for producers or both. And so we're trying to get at that and figure out what benefits new varieties bring, and estimate the value to the industry as well as individual producers. A lot of that does depend on the timing and rate of adoption. I have some slides to show you next on the work we've been doing with historical data on table grape varieties that show this lag in adoption really well, how it happens in real life. And then finally, once we are done with the analysis, we're going to be disseminating a lot more materials to the general public, as well as researchers on this project. So right now we're focusing on objectives 1 and 2. We have we're working in 2 main directions. One is we're looking at historical analysis of what happens in the table grape industry, because as you'll see, so this industry has been really innovative in terms of new varieties that are coming to the market, and new varieties are replacing old varieties over time. And we don't really see that so much in wine grapes and raisin grapes. Julian and I have done quite a bit of work on wine grapes in the past, and if anything, the old varieties are actually gaining ground. So they're varieties planted for wine grapes are becoming more uniform. There's not as much diversity and not as much experimentation there. And then the second avenue of our analysis is this analysis of how consumers will perceive new varieties that are coming to the market. And we're specifically interested, for this part of the project, we're interested in attitudes towards genetic engineering as well as conventional breeding, because genetic engineering is really coming around, and we're expecting that will be used on crops like grapes in the future. And so we're trying to look ahead. And so we're looking at both, so we're starting with consumer attitudes. In Vitas Gen 1, we did a similar research looking at producer attitudes towards improved varieties, because our work was mainly on wine grapes. And so we're curious, as Julian just described, in producer acceptance of varieties that were bred to be like Chardonnay, but could not be called Chardonnay. So I'll talk a little bit about the results from that as well. And finally, we will, so once we're done with this, we will look at total economic value for these improved varieties. And so that's hopefully coming next year. So table grapes are the category of grapes we're focusing most on Vitas Gen 2. We have compiled extensive data on acreage by variety over time, which I will show to you shortly. We're working on prices, similar data for prices in yields, and also looking at grapes in the context of the global economy as well. There has been a lot of development there. And then so I'll start with this slide. This is a little bit busy. I have some slides that break this out a bit more. So these are all table grape varieties in California from 1971 until 2017. I highlighted the major ones. And then the red lines and the varieties in red are the major varieties that have been released along with the time of their release. There have been a lot more varieties that have come to the market, but not all of them are on this graph, just because it was getting busy already. And so you can see as now I'll go by color because it's easier to see. So these are black table grape varieties, which are the minority in California. It's not the case globally. So the biggest grape variety in the world is Kyoho grapes in China, which is a black table grape variety, and that's more than that has more, the acreage is greater than Cabernet Sauvignon. So I'll go back for a second. So as you can see, between 1971 and now, the total acreage of table grapes has stayed pretty much the same. The jump in the middle is largely due to Thompson seedless grapes, which is it's technically a raisin grape variety, but some of the Thompson seedless grapes are sold fresh. And so we incorporated that with the help of the Table Grape Commission into our study. So this is acreage of Thompson seedless that was sold as table grapes, even though it's listed as raisin grape acreage in the report. So, and that's going away. As you can see, a lot less is used for fresh grapes. And so that's the jump in total acreage. So that it's not that more has been planted, it's stayed about the same, it's just that we're using fewer raisin grapes as table grapes. So black table grape varieties have the smallest share, but you can see all the varieties are becoming more diverse. And then there's definitely, you can look at a bit of a lag from Autumn Royal, which was released in 1996. And then it doesn't really appear on this graph until about 2000. So there's a delay because once the new variety is released, growers don't just rip up the old varieties, they wait until they need to be replaced and then they plant the new variety. So there's that lag of adoption, and you can see that the variety doesn't take over the market, so there is some market share. So that's where the table that Julian just showed you in terms of payoffs to adoption, both in terms of how fast it gets adopted and by what percentage of the market, you can really see that in real life. And I'll look at that closer that in a moment. So, and this is the big picture of what happened in the table grape varieties and the black table grape varieties between 1971 and now. And you can see that the acreage stayed about the same, maybe decreased a little bit, but went from 9 varieties to 20 varieties. And the most dominant variety, which used to be Riviere, is completely replaced. It does not, I think there's very, very little of it left, if any. And so now the dominant is Autumn Royal, which was released in 1996. Green table grapes are the second largest category. So you can see a lot of that was Thompson seedless for a while, and we have some new varieties coming on the market. And again, you can see a lag between the time a variety appears, like Sugar One in 1972, and then the lag from when growers start planting it, and it slowly grows over time, and then we'll see that some varieties also go away. So what we're doing now is, now that we have we see what's happening with table grape acreage, and we know when the varieties are released. We also know who releases the varieties. Some of these are private, some of these are USDA. We can start comparing the returns to growers, so both from increase in price and decrease in cost per acre over time, and hopefully looking at that in the context of the entire industry. And now we have Autumn King that appeared in 2005, also gaining market share while Thompson Seedless is going away. And then same picture as with the black varieties. It's almost to the latter in except for difference in total acreage. So say acreage stays constant, 28,000 acres, slightly decreased to 26, but it's within the couple thousand acres, but we went from 7 varieties to 20. Again, new varieties are gaining ground as opposed to older ones like Perlat and Kilmeria, which have almost entirely gone away. And finally, so the red table grape varieties are the dominant category in California. And here it's actually a little bit, the picture is even more clear. So we have Flame Seedless is a great example. It came on in 1973 and started kind of gaining ground in 1980s. And now it's actually slowly going away. So the last variety that I have on this graph in 2012, it's the C5163. It's commonly called Vintage Red, and the other trade name for that is Crimson Killer. So I think that it's pretty clear what the intention, I guess, of releasing that is that it's in some way superior to Crimson Seedless, and we don't really see that acreage in the data yet, but we can still look at difference in payoffs per acre, for example, for the short time it's there. And again, if we look at the big picture again, so we have 50,000 acres for red table grape varieties, slightly decreasing to 46,000 acres, and we're going from 6 to 23 varieties. So for every category of table grapes, there's this huge jump in diversity, and varieties have changed drastically in the last 40 years. And so we're looking at, next we're looking at the difference in prices and yields, because even though you see that the total acreage does not change, we know that the yields have increased because the industry revenue has increased. And we're looking at the costs and returns per acre for each of these new varieties compared to the old varieties, and how that affected grower payoffs and payoffs to the industry over time. So that is the next steps that we're, that's the big picture analysis, using historical data. We're also going to put that in the context of the world economy. So table grapes are a much bigger part of the world economy than they are in California, and new varieties are coming on the market there as well. As I mentioned, China now has more than 10 times table grape production compared to California, and that has increased just in the last 10 years by a lot. And in the U.S. context, we realize that the table grape industry is moving in a similar direction than apples. I included a graph from Washington. This is acreage by variety in Washington State. Did not quite have it going back as far as grapes, but between 1971 and 2017, went from 161,000 acres to 167,000 acres, which is about not a huge growth in acreage, but 6 to 20 varieties, which is pretty much exactly what was happening with table grapes. So we're looking at other parallels from that industry. Apples have become more diversified, and there's a lot more emphasis on varietal attributes, especially consumer attributes. So if you ever go to, we have Nugget here, or like Whole Foods, You can, in the apple season now, we have posters that suggest pairings of different varieties of apples with different food or drink, or what you can, which apples are best for baking and which apples are best for putting in a salad. So that's an interesting trend, and we think that that's probably what is happening to some extent with table grapes as well. So there's definitely emphasis on some producer attributes, such as decrease in costs, varieties that color easier, so they require fewer applications of agents that help with coloring and disease control and so on. But consumers are also becoming more interested in flavor and other varietal attributes. All right, so next I will talk a bit. I have about a little under 10 minutes left, and we want to leave some time for questions. In addition to the second avenue of our analysis is looking at consumer and producer preferences in terms of specific traits. And in Vitis Gen 2, we're focusing on consumer preferences. In Vitis Gen 1, we looked at producer preferences because we were interested in producer acceptance of wine grape varieties that had non-vinifera names. So since we don't have results from Vitis Gen 2 survey yet, I will talk about what we're doing in the survey, and the results should be coming by our next webinar very soon. We do have some results from Vitis Gen 1 survey with producers. Detailed results were recently published in the AJAV article that Julian also cited, so if anybody is interested, they can go look there. But so what we did was an online survey of one grape growers that includes questions that you normally see in surveys, like, oh, what do you prefer, or rank some things in terms of importance, which I'll go over. But the most interesting is it's an experimental design that helps people make a choice between planting a variety with specific attributes. The experimental design is described in the table here. So we had producers choose between option A, which was a variety not resistant to powdery mildew, and then option B is a variety resistant to powdery mildew. Each of these varieties, so there were multiple combinations of price per vine, powdery mildew resistance. Option A was always no, and option B was always yes. Genetic modification, even though it's not used to produce grapes, we included that to kind of look at producer acceptance of genetic modification as a way to breed grapes. And we did that at the time because, and I don't know if that's still true or not, but technically genetically modified varieties had a chance of actually retaining vinifera name. The decision on that has not been made as of time. So we wanted to see if people would be accepting of genetic modification if they could keep the vinifera name, versus varieties that were bred using conventional methods were only able to be called, Chardonnay-like, so it would not be called Chardonnay. And this is a big deal for producers of wine. Now, resistant varieties, we varied application. So in the experiment, we just assumed that we would not be applying pesticides. In our other analysis, like I said, we retained some of the fungicide applications. And then we varied the reduction in environmental impact and impact on worker health. So what we did with the survey, this is the example of questions that producers answered. Some of similar questions will be asked from consumers of table grapes this time around. So this was for producers of wine grapes. So it's a little bit different framing, but similar similar methodology. So the producer was asked to choose between planting vine option A versus vine option B, with some variation in price, varietal name, a resistance to disease, and then the environmental impact and impact on worker health were some of the ways we try to measure non-pecuniary benefits from resistance. Before we asked the experimental questions, we did ask people the standard preference questions on what you think is the most important. So that we got answers that the producers wanted to apply fewer fungicides, which is understandable because it costs money. And then they wanted varieties wanted fruit to taste better, and recognizable varieties fourth on the list. So the varietal name is very important. And then other traits, as you would pretty much expect. Improved acid sugar balance and so on. And so based on answers to our survey, we were able to simulate market share for these hypothetical varieties, and we found that as a baseline, using the same price per vine and conventional breeding, so Chardonnay-like name, the powdery mildew resistant varieties would be, about 50-50 split, slightly higher market share. And then the varied number of fungicide applications. So for varieties that you had to spray fewer, so if you had a variety that was not powdery mildew resistant, but you were able to get away with fewer sprays per year, either because of the climate or because of the powdery mildew pressure that year, the growers would prefer to plant a non-powdery mildew resistant variety. So you see a change in market share by growth by about 12%. If the powdery mildew resistant variety became more expensive, the market share would drop, as you would expect. The biggest effect we saw, though, was when we allowed the powdery mildew resistant variety to keep a varietal name. That would significantly increase the market share, and growers, we actually estimated some willingness to pay numbers based on survey responses, and I think the number was they were willing to pay up to $16 per variety if it was powdery mildew resistant and was able to keep the Chardonnay name. So the resistance to breeding methods does not come from growers, it comes from more consumer acceptance of products that were produced using specific technology. So we're doing something similar with this part of the Vitis Gen 2, but we're asking these experimental questions from table grape consumers. We are administering the survey online probably within the next month or two. I know it's really close to being finished. Targeting about 2,000 consumers of table grapes. We'll be asking normal screening questions about table grape consumption, and we're focusing the survey on consumer perceptions on food and science technology, and specifically conventional breeding versus gene editing. Do people know the difference? Do they care? Do they care for fresh produce such as grapes versus processed things like cereal or grape jelly or grape juice? We find that there may be difference there. And do they, and finally, do they, kind of standard questions? Do they like sweet grapes? Are there, differences in preferences by color? Other grape attributes like fruitiness or some specific flavor? I mean, we have seen some grape varieties come on the market, like cotton candy, that have very distinct cotton candy flavor and so on. So this is the next step in this ex-ante analysis, where we're looking at what we think will happen before these varieties are released. So the first part of our analysis looks at historical trends and payoffs over time from varieties that were released in the past. This part of our analysis is trying to make some, I wouldn't say forecasts, but educated guesses about what will happen to varieties that are released in the future. This is where I will leave off for questions for both me and Julian. But I think we have about 8 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. And I'd like to mention that if you want to ask a question, go to the either the chat bar or the Q&A thing. If you don't see a menu, you can bring your mouse down to the bottom of the screen and click on the Q&A, and then we'll get those questions. Lena, this is interesting, and you have that great amount of historical data for variety changes. I think that's really wonderful, and that's going to make your estimates more robust. I guess my question is, there are a lot of private breedings programs and proprietary varieties, and I'm assuming that most of the varieties that you had on that retrospective survey were public varieties. Can you comment on the public versus the private and how that affects your data?
Well, we know which varieties are private and which are public. We have not really differentiated between the two as of now. So right now we're just comparing the prices and costs of producing a specific variety. We might have some things to say about rights over varieties, or who can grow them. I know there are differences that way, but we have not quite gotten that far yet.
Okay, thank you. We got another question here. I'm gonna, so Drew Kettleson says, is Qualtrics an internet survey?
Yes, it is. It's a, so Qualtrics is an internet survey platform, and it's very convenient because you can request. In our case, we're requesting 2,000 consumers of table grapes, so they will pre-screen the population for you. So we're eliminating a lot of the kind of non-answers to our surveys, or trying to find a population. A lot of the times people use university students, which is not a good population for online surveys. So Qualtrics actually is great because it provide you can ask for respondents by demographic category, and they will do a really good job of providing a sample for you.
Okay, I have another one for both of you, and I think that after all the money that's gone into the PD fund over the years in California, that you've been able to document, it's really gratifying to have these 5 new varieties from Andy Walker's program come out. Do you have any plans to try and track adoption of these varieties over the next several years, or any thoughts about where those varieties are going to have their most impact?
I'll take a go at that one, Tim. Yes, plans is probably a stronger word than I would use. I'm thinking that I want to do that, and I don't need to track over time. I just need to sometime in the future take a snapshot and see what's happened. And I think it's a bit early yet, but in a few years' time, it'll be very interesting. What we expect will happen is a couple of things. One is that the first place to adopt these varieties is likely to be in the Napa Valley, in the riparian corridor, where there are areas of very valuable land that's just been abandoned because of Pierce's disease.
Yeah.
So they'll be able to plant these varieties along there, and then they'll be able to blend the juice with Chardonnay or Cabernet or whatever, and without foregoing the label, so long as the blend proportion doesn't get too high. And so I'm expecting there'll be quite rapid adoption there. I'm speculating. And in other places where Pierce's disease pressure is very high, likewise. And the other thing that can happen is that and I think this is already happening, is that the industry can produce non-varietal blends. They're doing lots of that, and so these varieties will be able to, they'll be able to use them that way without incurring any kind of market penalty because of the varietal names.
Yeah, I think one of my thoughts about this is that these are going to be very more readily adapted in places where they don't have monocultures of Cabernet Sauvignon and Chardonnay, and where they have been unable to grow those because of Pierce's disease. I'm thinking of the lower 2/3 of Texas and maybe the southeast. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with those varieties, which are the first ones to be released from the University of California since when?
Oh, I forget. Long time.
Ruby Red, right?
Yeah,
or Ruby
I forget,
Cabernet.
I forget, Tim. It was probably on that slide. But no, I did mean to mention we did a review of the history of wine production in the United States, and there is enormous potential production outside California in places that were lost because of Pierce's disease. So that it's going to be very interesting to see what happens in those other places in the next 10, 20 years.
Yeah. Okay, I have another question here from Drew Kettleson, who also asked the last question about Qualtrics. And this may be off topic, I don't know. But the question is, what is the differences between Qualtrics and Idea Map software? Is that in either of your wheelhouses, or?
No.
I'm not familiar
with respect to this part of the project, this is being led by Brad Rickard and Karina Gallardo, and they both know a lot about those things, and I think they'll be doing a webinar sometime soon, Tim, on this.
Yes, yes, we have it currently scheduled for March 31st. And I don't know if the survey's gone public yet. So.
Not yet. That may be too early, but we'll see.
Yeah. Okay. We'll have to play that by ear. Can I turn, anyhow, thank you so much, Julian and Olena. I think we've exhausted the questions now. I really appreciate this. It's been recorded, so it'll be available to a wider audience in the future. And thank you so much for coming on. I'm going to turn it back over to Becky now.
Thanks, Tim.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you guys. That was a really great presentation. Thank you, Julian and Olena, in particular. One second. Why is this not doing what it's supposed to do? There we go.
Okay, so what should I do, Becky? Just
you're good. Just
shut down. Leave the meeting.
I don't know. I mean, you can sit if you'd like to. I just want to say thank you. You guys did a great presentation. And then I want to just thank everybody who attended and invite you to visit the Vitis Gen 2 website, which you should be able to see on your screen right now, the address for it. Excuse me, sorry. And invite you to follow us on Twitter at VitisGen. And additionally, I wanted to say that you should keep an eye out in your email for a short survey that will show up later today. And it'll only take you a couple minutes, and it'll help us improve any of our future webinars. So we'd love to get your feedback on that. But yeah, thank you guys so much for attending. And I think that that's everything that I have to say.
And thank you again, Julian and Elena.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Farewell.
Yep.
Yep.